안녕하세요. 코로나 백신이 나오고 나서 코로나 백신에 대해서 설명을 해달라는 요청이 많아서 제가 그것에 대해서 이야기를 할까 하다가 2주 전에 UCLA 공중보건학 교수님인 닥터 시라 샤퍼 교수님이 강의를 한 게 있었는데요. 제가 자료를 해서 하나하나 이야기를 하는 것보다 아예 그분이 강의를 여기다 실는 것이 더 나을 것 같아서 닥터 샤퍼와 병원이 허락을 받고 나서 그 강의 영상을 번역을 해서 오늘 올립니다. 이 백신에 대해서 궁금하시거나 질문이 있으신 분들은 아래 댓글란에 댓글을 남겨주시면 앞으로 감염내과 전문의 선생님이나 다른 교수님을 초청을 해서 한번 이야기를 해보는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I have no financial disclosures, as always. So this presentation is current as of 5 p.m. yesterday. There have been nearly 90 million cases of COVID-19 that have been confirmed and reported to the World Health Organization. And unfortunately, we're very rapidly approaching the point where we will have had 2 million total deaths. Part of the reason that's so important to note is when we now look at the picture in the United States, there have been more than 22 million total cases, and there have been over 375,000 total deaths. So the United States represents roughly 20% of all the deaths from COVID-19, and we certainly do not represent 20% of the world's population. So we do have an overrepresentation of deaths here in the United States, as well as an overrepresentation of cases. The other thing that's really important to look at on this particular image is the average daily cases per 100,000 people in the last 7 days, because that gives us a sense not just of the burden that we have had in the United States since the beginning, so since January 21st, but rather what has been happening over the last week. Terrifying seems a little hyperbolic, but it's really frightening to see how these numbers have been inching up day over day, month over month. And in fact, for every 100,000 people in the United States, we're seeing 75.2 new cases of COVID-19 in the last 7 days. I just want to sort of talk about how we got here, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have a virus that has an R naught of more than 2, so each infected person on average will infect 2 more people, and that means the more infected people you have, the more cases you will generate unless there are very aggressive public health control measures. So just so you can see, this is what the epidemic curve looks like in the United States, and we are clearly in the midst of a second surge, if not a third surge. So local health departments have reported over 76,000 confirmed positive cases in healthcare workers, and unfortunately, we've seen 288 deaths statewide. The image here you see is a composite image made up of photographs of individuals who are healthcare workers who have died from COVID-19. So before we dive into some of the vaccines, I thought it would be helpful to just talk about this biphasic pattern of illness that we typically see with COVID-19. It likely results from an early viral response phase and then an inflammatory second phase. And the immune response, we know, plays a substantial role in determining clinical outcomes. We know that the body does not develop an immune response immediately after exposure. That is both exposure to a vaccine and exposure to the natural pathogen. So you may hear stories of individuals who got one shot of their vaccine and then they developed COVID-19 5 days, a week later. That is totally expected for 2 reasons. The first is that we know 2 doses of the vaccines that are available right now are needed in order to confer full protection. And the second is that typically that full protection will not be conferred until 7 days after the second injection. So that's particularly important to remember, those of you who have already had your first vaccine, or even those of you who have already had your second vaccine. It does take time for the body to mount that protective immune response. So exposures that happen even after vaccination can still lead to illness. So let's dive into the vaccines and how they work and what we know about them. The work on the vaccines began specifically in January when we had the SARS-CoV-2 genome sequenced. But that's a little bit disingenuous because what we actually have to say is work on these vaccines began in 2003 when we had the SARS outbreak at that time. Because if we just talk about the fact that it is truly sort of a miracle of science that we got a vaccine so quickly, people may think that it moved too fast. So we do have to acknowledge that the work actually began about 17 years ago. The first vaccine safety trial started in March. There are 20 vaccines that are in phase 3. And as we know, there were 2 that have been submitted to the FDA for emergency use authorization. So let's do a brief reminder of how we develop immunity in response to vaccines, because that will help provide further context to our conversation about the vaccines themselves. So we know with natural infection, the virus enters the body. It uses its spike protein to lock onto the ACE2 receptors on the surface of human cells. Once it gets inside, it forces the human cell to translate its RNA to produce more copies of the virus. Now, on the right side, what we see is the immune response that happens once someone is exposed to a pathogen or once someone is exposed to a vaccine. So essentially, the virus gets ingested by what's known as the antigen-presenting cells. So the antigen-presenting cells engulf it. They'll display portions to activate the T helper cells. The T helper cells are sort of the helpers, which they are further enabling the immune response. They help 2 different types of cells. The first is our B cell, and our B cells are the ones that are going to produce those antibodies. And the second is the cytotoxic T cells. Those are sort of the assassins of the immune system. Once we develop immunity and antibodies, we can develop long-lived memory B and T cells. So we have them, and then when we get re-exposed to the pathogen, those memory cells are going to proliferate, and they'll be there to help combat the pathogen and the infection. So there are several different types of vaccine approaches that have been utilized in order to try and bring vaccines to market. Importantly, the vast majority of these work on the spike protein, which is one of the reasons that some of the variants have been concerning, because the variants have alterations in their spike. As of right now, it appears we still have vaccine efficacy for the variant, particularly the UK variant. So that's not a concern right now, but it's something we need to be aware of for the future. So the first type of vaccine is a viral vector vaccine. These essentially have viruses that are engineered to carry coronavirus genes. Some of the viral vector vaccines enter cells. They cause them to make viral proteins. Other viral vectors slowly replicate, carrying coronavirus proteins on their surface. So 2 most noteworthy here, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, but also I want to call out Johnson & Johnson's Janssen vaccine. This one is particularly noteworthy for 2 reasons. The first, it's the only vaccine in Operation Warp Speed that requires just a single dose. Johnson & Johnson, we do believe they are going to be submitting for emergency use authorization by next month, but it was just announced today that they are having some significant production and supply chain issues. So it will be quite some time until we actually have this vaccine available for use. The 2 vaccines that have received emergency use authorization are both genetic vaccines. So what these do, they use messenger RNA or mRNA technology, and each strand of mRNA that exists is designed to encode for a protein. So what they have done is they have taken essentially the instructions for the production of the spike protein. They're putting the instructions into the cell, and then the body sort of takes over and says, I recognize this as an instruction. I will now make this. And that means the body will have seen the spike protein. It can produce those B cells and cytotoxic T cells in response to the spike protein, so that if an individual gets exposed to and infected with the virus itself, there will already be neutralizing antibodies and immunologic memory to fight off that infection. One thing that's really important, mRNA itself is very, very unstable. And so that's the reason why the mRNA vaccines have to be kept in ultra cold storage, and they have a very, very limited life in between when they come out of that ultra cold storage and when they have to be given or when they will ultimately spoil. Novavax is working on protein-based vaccines. They've actually started their phase 3 clinical trials. One big thing to know about protein-based vaccines, and we have a number of these that are already on the market and are safe for other pathogens. So, for example, the HBV vaccine, typically they require adjuvants or they require multiple doses. So that's something we'll have to expect when we see results from the Novavax vaccine. And then the last one to note is inactivated or attenuated vaccines. The vaccines that are all available outside of the United States that have been made available with very, very limited safety and efficacy data all use this approach. So essentially what they do is they take a virus, they kill it or they inactivate it, and they inject the whole virus. There tend to be pretty significant side effects from inactivated or attenuated vaccines, and there's nothing that's being considered in the United States that uses this approach. All right, so we now have two vaccines that have been given emergency use authorization in the United States. Both of them are mRNA vaccines. Pfizer was the first to receive its emergency use authorization in December. And then a week later, Moderna also received its emergency use authorization. For both of these vaccines, they do require 2 injections. The Pfizer vaccine is given 21 days apart, with immunity being achieved 7 days after the second vaccination. The Moderna vaccine, the doses are given 28 days apart, with immunity being achieved 7 days after. Both of them appear to be about 95% effective. So this is an image that was from the Pfizer data that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine recently. And essentially what you can see when we compare the blue, those are individuals who received the placebo, to what we see in red in terms of new cases and efficacy days after a dose. There is some immunity that is generated after the first dose, but in order to achieve that 95%, we really do need individuals to receive both doses of the vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine is approved for individuals 16 years of age and older. The Moderna vaccine is only approved for those over the age of 18. And I'll talk in a little bit about what this might mean for those of you who are pediatricians or in family practice, or for those of you who are parents and desperately want to know that your children will be able to be vaccinated in advance of going back to school. The FDA indicated over the summer that if there was a vaccine candidate that had at least 50% efficacy, they would give it an emergency use authorization, given how serious our epidemic here is in the United States. It's truly remarkable that the efficacy of these vaccines appears to be 95% after the second dose, which now makes it one of the most effective vaccines that has ever been developed. I know that there are questions, particularly from individuals who are vaccine hesitant or wouldn't ordinarily consider themselves vaccine hesitant, but worry because this vaccine has come to availability so quickly. As a result, the federal government is engaged in a massive, what we call post-licensure surveillance program. So we do this for every single vaccine, and normally this happens through the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is a passive surveillance system. So if anybody has a complication of any kind that occurs after vaccination, they can report it to VAERS. But recognizing how challenging it might be to collect data to convince individuals about the need to take this vaccine, the Centers for Disease Control launched vSafe. So this is actually an active surveillance program. So it's a smartphone-based after-vaccination health checker for people who receive the COVID-19 vaccine. And essentially what happens is they sign up with vSafe. They get a text message every single day for the first week post-vaccination. And then they get a weekly message thereafter for 6 weeks, looking for clinically important events that are being reported, with the ability for a clinician at the CDC to follow up on any clinically important events and report a VAERS event if appropriate. So it's important to note that there are some side effects from these vaccines, but there are side effects from almost every vaccine. And one of the most important comparators here is actually to look at the side effects that are reported from people receiving placebo. So 14% of people who get injected in the arm with nothing but saline report that they have pain. We can also see that 34% of them report that they have headache. So while it is something we need to be talking about, that the COVID-19 vaccines do come along with local pain, Most people report that their arm feels pretty uncomfortable for 24 to 48 hours. We can also see it can come along with fatigue and headache. In fact, compared to COVID-19 itself, we aren't really seeing that this is particularly significant. And it's also nothing more than what we would see or expect from some of the other vaccines that we have available. So I do just want to mention a little bit about what we've been hearing about these adverse events. Never before in the history of a vaccine have we seen real-time reporting of every single vaccine reaction. And the scrutiny surrounding COVID-19 vaccines, combined with our constant breaking news cycle, has the potential to create a lot of undue concern to expected and known adverse events. So every time a reported adverse event associated with COVID vaccine occurs, we have to understand the context. And particularly, we need to know how many total vaccines have been given, how many of each event have occurred, what is the expected rate, and that helps us to provide some level of context about whether or not this is more or less than we have been expecting. For the first 1 million people vaccinated in the United States, less than 10 had significant allergic reactions. So that's a rate of less than 1 per 100,000. And to put that in context, about 1 in 2,000 courses of penicillin leads to an allergic reaction. And 1 in 200 individuals have had anaphylaxis to a medication at some point in their life. So it is not surprising that we are seeing some of these adverse events. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that the CDC is constantly reviewing this data, constantly updating its recommendations. So this just gives you a little bit more data as of the December 26th, when we had just under 2 million doses, and the data that showed most of the time it was mild to moderate reactions. There were only 8 total serious. 4 of them did lead to hospitalizations as a result of anaphylaxis. But all of you know far better than I can, anaphylaxis is a condition that can be medically managed. Right now, we are struggling, even after a year of experience, we're struggling to medically manage all cases of COVID-19. We still have fairly high case fatality amongst those cases. And beyond that, we don't have hospital beds or ICU beds in which to treat these individuals. So on balance, it is far more important, even if an individual may be at risk of anaphylaxis, it is far more important for them to receive the vaccine and have that anaphylactic reaction medically managed. CDC has come up with this guidance with respect to risk assessment and potential deferral of vaccination. And essentially what they first said is it's only those with a history of severe vaccine-related allergies or severe allergies to other injectable therapies. So if someone has a severe peanut or shellfish allergy, they would not be deferred from vaccination. The clinical guidance says if they do have a history of severe allergic reaction, including anaphylaxis, they should be observed for 30 minutes. Everyone else just needs to be observed for 15. And the most recent guidance from CDC, essentially, the only people who are contraindicated to either the Pfizer-BioNTech or the Mrna vaccine, number one, anybody who's had a severe allergic reaction to the first shot should not receive the second dose. Anybody who had an immediate allergic reaction of any severity to a previous dose of the COVID-19 vaccine or any of its components. And then finally, right now, the concern is that the allergenic component is one of the excipients in the vaccine, polyethylene glycol in the vaccine. So anybody who's had an immediate allergic reaction of any severity to polysorbate because of the polyethylene glycol in the vaccine should be considered to be contraindicated. But realistically, everybody else should be encouraged to receive the vaccine when it is their time. I promised you I'd mention a little bit about children. And so the Pfizer vaccine, as I mentioned, is approved for those over the age of 16. And there is some indication from Pfizer that they are aiming to bring up their emergency use authorization for those as young as 12 years old if they get sufficient data over the course of the next few months. Moderna has actually started dosing adolescents in a phase 2-3 clinical trial. They are aiming to try and see if they can get approval for children as young as 12 before the start of the 2021 school year. But as of yesterday, Moderna actually announced that they think their data most likely won't be available until 2022 when it comes to any children 11 years of age and younger. You may be asking if you have the opportunity to choose between Pfizer and Moderna. And as of right now, the answer is no. People will be offered only one. They will have to come back to receive their second dose of the same vaccine. Eventually, as we have had sufficient rollout of vaccination and we have sufficient supplies, people may be given the choice. From an epidemiologic perspective, there is no reason right now to prefer one over the other. The other thing that's important to note is they are both 2-dose series, and they have only been approved for use as a 2-dose where you receive both of the same vaccine. But interestingly, right now, even though they're not interchangeable, the guidance says if an individual receives one and then receives another dose of a different mRNA vaccine, no additional product is recommended. So as much as possible, the approval is only to be using the same vaccine for both doses, but the guidance specifies that they don't have to be given more. Let's also briefly mention the other candidate vaccines. So in the United Kingdom, they have approved the use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which, as you will remember, is a viral vector vaccine. So it uses different technology than the genetic vaccines we have here in the United States. There were, in fact, some pretty significant dosing errors. So the FDA has indicated that they will not be approving vaccines, this vaccine in the United States, until they see the results of a randomized controlled trial that is being conducted here in the US. But if everything goes well with that trial, the expected readout will be somewhere in early April, and AstraZeneca is manufacturing doses of these vaccines at cost, so under the assumption that it will be purchased once it gets approved by the FDA. We also know that in addition to the AstraZeneca, there is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that they are expecting their results by the end of this month. But unfortunately, as was announced today, while the vaccine might prove to be safe and effective, there are some significant manufacturing and supply chain constraints for that vaccine. So we, in fact, may have to wait until we really have access to that one.